Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In this episode, I'm joined by John Salza and Andrew Bartel to talk about the Society of St. Pius X. Welcome, Andrew, and welcome, John. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom.
Awesome. Well, I'll kick it off. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, and I'm going to include a short bio for both of you in the show notes when we're done. So I'll start with you, John.
Well, thanks for having me, Dom and Andrew. I'm John Salza. I am a husband and father, practicing attorney for the past 25 years, and also a Catholic author and apologist. I've been in that game for over 20 years. I'm a cradle Catholic, born and raised Catholic, and right away at about 30 years old, I had kind of a strong reversion to the faith, and it wasn't very long after that I embraced Catholic tradition. This is going back again about 25 years ago, being attracted to the traditional teachings, the liturgy, the doctrines of the church. And so, my approach has always been just to teach the Catholic faith. I do a lot of work in the area of scripture, scriptural apologetics, but most recently, more on a doctrinal level with Catholic tradition, what Catholic tradition really is all about.
Wonderful. Awesome. And how about you, Andrew?
So, as many people are familiar, anyone who's read my open letter on Catholic World Report, I was raised in the traditionalist Catholic movement, especially the Sspx and Sedevacantist groups. That was my upbringing, and it was shortly after I came back from France. I was studying at the boys' school, the Dominican boys' school in Avrillé. It was a Dominican community founded by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And it was around that time that the conflict of 2012 over discussions in Rome was happening between the Sspx and the what eventually became the Sspx resistance, headed by clergy such as Bishop Williamson, Father Pfeiffer, Father Chazal, and others. And it was that split that really began my journey back into the full communion of the Roman Catholic Church.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, it's great to have both of you. Just a quick overview. I grew up in the SSPX myself, transitioned around the age of 12 to the Fraternity of St. Peter, basically went to one of their high schools. I have nothing but appreciation for all the wonderful things I've learned. I then spent 2 years in a monastery of the Congregation of Salem. It's Our Lady of Clear Creek in Oklahoma. And honestly, in that monastery is I would attribute that experience to my entering more into full communion with the church. Yeah, that's basically it. So what we'll do is we'll start with you, John, if you don't mind. And could you maybe give us an overview as to what led you into the Society of St. Pius X and what led you out of it? Big topic,
Sure.
I know.
What led me to the society were geographical reasons, not doctrinal reasons. I had been attending the traditional Latin Mass and a diocesan Mass daily. When I moved out to a rural area, the Society Chapel was less than 15 minutes from my house. And so I would attend the Society Chapel with my wife and children on the weekends, on Sunday and holy days, but I would be attending the diocesan Latin Mass during the week. That ultimately became the Institute of Christ the King. And so I continued to attend. I'm a parishioner at the Institute where Christ the King serves. And it's funny, when I first came to the SSPX chapel and I explained to the priests after, they said, "Hey, where'd you come from?" I said, "Well, I attend Mass at the Institute during the week and the Society on the weekends." They didn't like to hear that. In fact, and truth be told, they all told me invariably that I should not be attending a Mass, even if it's traditional, that's in union with the local bishop in the Roman Catholic Church. And so all the society priests effectively said that. And so I did sense there was a schismatic mentality and an attitude there. I immediately objected to that. I told each and every priest who told me that I disagreed with that position. I wouldn't be following that counsel. And that ended that discussion. So I wasn't at the society for doctrinal reasons. One might say liturgical reasons, but primarily it was geographical. It was more convenient. I now have to drive close to an hour to the traditional mass, which was okay. 12 minutes was a lot easier, and that's really what led me to the society. But I was there for 15 years. You know, all my children have gone through the society. They received their sacraments at the society. We were faithful parishioners, if you will, even though they're technically not parishes, as you know. And I didn't really dig in very deeply to the society's doctrinal and canonical positions. For me, I was satisfied with this notion that necessity was sufficient to justify what they were doing. But that is a grave error. I fell into the error that the Catholic faith and Catholic tradition is identified almost exclusively with the traditional Mass. You see, and this is sad to say, but this is a fundamental error in the Catholic traditional movement right now. They identify the Catholic faith with the traditional Mass almost exclusively. And whoever says the old Mass is a good and faithful Catholic. To be a good and faithful Catholic, you attend Mass, or if you're a priest, you say the old Mass and you reject Vatican II and the new Mass without regard to whether that clergy is a member of the Catholic Church, is in the juridical structure of the Catholic Church, or has a canonical mission from the Catholic Church. And this is fundamentally an error in ecclesiology. And I've written about this. The error right now afflicting the traditional Catholic movement is most traditional Catholics do not understand what the Roman Catholic Church is, that she is a juridical structure, a hierarchy established by Jesus Christ that has ordinary jurisdiction that flows from Christ to the Pope to the bishops. There is a legal structure there outside of which there is no grace or salvation. And so, you know, this is ultimately what led me away from the society completely, was a greater and deeper understanding of ecclesiology.
Wonderful. Okay, can you hear me? I was muted.
Yeah.
Sorry. Wonderful. Thank you, John. So, I mean, Andrew, can you relate to any of this in your transition outside of the Society of St. Pius X?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually be interested to hear John's take and what his study, his in-depth study of Sedevacantism had the role that had to play in his conversion. Because I know for me, as I delved more and more into the Sedevacantist issues, they're definitely a lot stronger in the terms of ecclesiology than I found in the Sspx. They have a little bit of a better understanding of, you know, the role of. Now, of course, they still have their own issues and areas in ecclesiology, but in certain areas such as the role of the papacy and you know, certain aspects of the church, they were revealing, especially things such as indefectibility and infallibility. They were revealing things that I had not heard very much in my area where I interacted with in the Sspx. And I know for me, as soon as I started getting into this, especially as I was listening to the work of Jerry Matitix, he did a talk called Unauthorized Shepherds, where he gets into the teaching of St. Francis de Sales on mission. And he identifies that there's two types of missions, mediate and immediate. And John Salza has done a great job bringing out a lot of this work, because it's not very well known in the traditionalist Catholic movement outside of kind of this smaller group that follows people like Jerry Matitix. I honestly never even heard about the importance of mission, the central importance of mission, and how that holds so much together until Jerry Matitix, who is a Sedevacantist, introduced me to St. Francis de Sales. And as I delved into St. Francis de Sales, and there were other aspects that I was dealing with as well, such as the split off of the resistance, trying to figure out, okay, now who has the truth? Who's being more faithful to Archbishop Lefebvre? There were a lot of other things going on as well. But I would say the nail in the coffin for the Sspx for me was reading part 1 of the Catholic Controversy and realizing that there are no traditionalist clergy, whether Sedevacantist, or SSPX who exercise this mission, which is something that isn't just merely human law. It actually flows from divine law and divine nature. And so I'd be really interested to hear John get a little bit more into that. That'd be very, very interesting.
Yeah, same here. John, could you maybe talk to us about what it means to have mission and how that plays into the traditionalist movement?
Sure. I want to comment on something Andrew said first.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you don't mind. The Ecclesiology of Sedevacantism and the Society of St. Pius X is identical practically. It is a Protestant ecclesiology because they've reduced the church to those who simply profess the true faith without regard to whether they are in the juridical structure of the church with a canonical mission from the church. And so again, the ecclesiology of the Society and of the Sedevacantists is identical. It is Protestant ecclesiology, ultimately. They may profess that there is a juridical structure and a hierarchy, okay, but they can't reconcile their profession with the fact that they're not part of the structure. And what we would say is that there is a disconnect between the speculative and practical intellect of the Society and Sedevacantists. On the one hand, they will profess that the church is a visible hierarchical institution and mission is divine and comes from Christ. But on the other hand, that's the speculative, right? So they're professing what is true, but on the practical level, they don't believe that they need to be a part of that visible structure with a visible mission. The only difference between the Sedevacantists and the Society is that the Sedevacantists, even though they acknowledge there is a primacy, they don't believe anybody is currently occupying the chair, whereas the Society believes there is an occupant, but they don't have to obey him. They have practically repudiated his authority, you see? So the ecclesiology is Protestant. And if you go back to the Protestant revolt and you read the likes of Calvin and Zwingli, those men were zealous for the faith. I mean, they were liturgical. They were very strict, very doctrinal, just like we see today. You see, but their zeal led them out of the church, just like the Sades and the Society. In terms of mission, Andrew nailed it. It is a matter of divine law that clergy must have mission. I mean, Christ, the Father sends Christ, Christ sends the apostles, they send their successors. And so we say, and the church says that, for a bishop to licitly, that is lawfully exercise his ministry, he must have a canonical mission from the Pope. He must receive ordinary jurisdiction from the Pope as a matter of divine law. Then the priests who serve the bishop, right, they are then incarnated, it's called, incarnated into or attached to that bishop, where they participate in, they're like co-ministers in the bishop's ministry, and hence that's part of the canonical mission. But that's not part of, ecclesiastical law regulates that process, but it's truly fundamentally a matter of divine law. It's the way that Christ set up the church. And so when we hear the arguments, there's a necessity, there's crisis, necessity never circumvents or supplants the divine law, because the divine law foresees all things. Okay, necessity can never be used to circumvent the fact that a clergy must be part of and sent by the Roman Catholic Church to licitly minister in Christ's church.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, this reminds me of your debate, Andrew, on Pints with Aquinas. The idea that necessity allows you to break the speeding limit in order to save the child in your car, but you said no, it's more like running over someone to save the child in your car, which is never allowed, right? And so because the divine law can never be violated, because it always supplies, and it's you can't break the divine law so that to be faithful to truth. That's a dichotomy that's not possible in a genuine Catholic ecclesiology. And I mean, that's something else that for me, my transition away from traditionalism was seeing all the ironies in ecclesiology, this severance between tradition, capital T, and the magisterium, and how tradition can be known and adhered to apart from a defecting magisterium and its ordinary and extraordinary capacity. To me, I mean, that was a death blow for me. That's not Catholic ecclesiology. So I think we're on the same page here. Let's see. What about supplied jurisdiction? I want to bring this up because a lot of my SSPX friends bring up this argument. I mean, we're kind of talking about it already, but how would we because so has there been instances in the church when supplied jurisdiction takes place? Does canon law allow for supplied jurisdiction in certain instances?
Oh, it most certainly does. But the society has completely perverted the understanding of supplied jurisdiction. And frankly, when I dove into this issue, like many other issues with the Society of St. Pius X, I frankly cannot believe they've gotten away with these arguments for the last 45, 50 years. It's mind-boggling. And just to give you guys some background, when I wrote the book with my co-author, Robert Sisko, True or False Pope, it was fundamentally about the issue of ecclesiology. And after we applied it to the Sede Vacantis, I reached the inescapable conclusion that this applies to the society as well. I formed some private opinions about the matter. I then sought out some canonists who are extremely reputable. Some of them wear red hats, by the way, and they confirmed what I had concluded. And then I finally went to my bishop and I submitted dubia to my bishop, and I got a definitive judgment from him. And as a Roman Catholic, I'm bound to submit to his judgment. So this isn't just something that I did as an academic exercise. I truly took this in very deliberate steps all the way Rome and then to my bishop. But in terms of supplied jurisdiction, I can make it as simple as this. Supplied jurisdiction exists when the Catholic community would err that a clergy has been sent by the local bishop. That's fundamentally when supplied jurisdiction kicks in. That's called common error. There's another way it kicks in when you have positive or probable doubt, which is where generally the priest has concrete belief that he has jurisdiction, but he may not. Now, neither common error nor positive or probable doubt could possibly apply to the Society of St. Pius X. Number one, because nobody in the Society of St. Pius X would be in error that society clergy were sent by the local bishop. They all know that their clergy are operating in opposition to the local bishop. That's the first point. But the second point is supplied jurisdiction is not intended to and does not protect SSPX communities because they're not the Catholic community to which common error would exist. Supplied jurisdiction is intended to protect the Catholic community, okay? Those who are in union with the local bishop. Therefore, even if somebody were in the society and thought that maybe these priests were sent, supplied jurisdiction would not exist because it's not intended to cover those people who are worshiping outside the Catholic Church. It's only intended for those who are in the Catholic Church. So technically, it would apply to the territorial parish in which the society chapel exists. And so if people, and the other thing is under canon law, the fact that these priests are suspended ad divinis, it's deemed to be known in the external form as a matter of canon law, which is another reason that supplied jurisdiction is completely barred from applying to the Society of St. Pius X. And I can tell you, some of them have now become aware of that because I've written in depth about this. I've been contacted by people who have extreme pangs of conscience, even Sede Vacantis, who now have put two and two together and know that marriages and confessions over the last 45 years have been invalid. Thank God that Pope Francis has delegated faculties in limited circumstances. We know for confessions and marriages, which, by the way, Cardinal Burke called an anomaly. It is an anomaly because they're not part of the Roman Catholic Church with a canonical mission from the Church. That was a complete act of mercy on the part of the Pope. But the reality is supplied jurisdiction has never applied in society chapels for those fundamental reasons.
Gotcha. Andrew, what do you think? Any musings?
Yeah, I think that that John is really nailing it on the head, and he's definitely, this is more his area of expertise than mine. For me, I think once I understood mission, which is what supply the whole nitty gritty of canon law, such as supplied jurisdiction and epikeia and all of that. These are like practical applications of the divine law. And when you are observing the spirit of that divine law and that institution or that divine constitution of the church is set up by Jesus Christ, everything else just kind of falls into place. You realize that a lot of this is just noise. And so for me, seeing the big picture was what really won me over, since I didn't necessarily have the same kind of expertise that John does in the area of law. So for me, it was theological. And then also, it was also just practical. It was realizing that, and this was because I'm more of a philosophical bent of mind. It was in my study of Sedevacantism, especially Sede-privationism, which was something I was more inclined toward, that the materialiter formaliter thesis, that the Holy See, that the people who occupy the See of Peter and the bishoprics, they occupy the material office, but they don't actually have the formal authority. And to me, that seemed like a clever philosophical way of being able to still have your cake and eat it too. I mean, I didn't think about it in those terms, but, be able to have a visible structure and say, well, here's the visible Catholic Church, but then at the same time say they don't actually have any real authority because they're a bunch of heretics. But then I realized as time went on was that there was a fundamental philosophical flaw in this, which was that while there was, you might be able to have the potency or the potential of having the See filled in practical, in the active practice of that, of the power of the See of Peter, of the power of the apostolic authority, it's not there. And this is why they constantly are splitting. They constantly have divisions and theological fights among themselves, because there is no one who has the final say. And so what I realized, especially as I was beginning to think, well, how are we actually going to get out of this mess? I began to realize that Sedevacantism is fundamentally flawed, because even if they were able to all come together, all the various Sedevacantists and traditionalist clergy, and elect a pope, if as soon as one bishop or one group or one priest decided that they had fallen into heresy, they just have to say they're a heretic, and then we don't have to listen to them. It's like the great schism all over again. You would not be able to have a functional papacy if anybody is able to just recognize on their own authority that, well, I think they're in heresy and therefore they've lost their office, so I'm going to go start my own thing. There's got to be some kind of protection that Christ left in place in order to prevent this kind of anarchy. Wouldn't you agree, John? You probably saw the exact same things.
Yes, I mean, that material pope thesis is so absurd. I mean, it's so novel and so absurd. Effectively, it's another example of private judgment, because they hold that because the pope and the bishops interiorly have the intent of destroying the church, they can't receive jurisdiction. That's ultimately what they say. But of course, the church doesn't judge the internal forum. So how can they judge the internal forum? Secondly, the church has never taught that an interior tension impedes one from receiving jurisdiction. Okay, it may be relevant to the sacraments, but in terms of jurisdiction, if a bishop has been lawfully appointed to an office, jurisdiction attaches to that office. When the Pope accepts the papacy, jurisdiction, supreme authority, is attached to the office. They receive it as a matter of divine law, ultimately through the primacy. And then, of course, the territorial jurisdiction, that's more of what the apostles made in their successors. But an interior and intention to destroy the church, which can never be proven in the external forum outside of a juridical trial, certainly in no way impedes the reception of jurisdiction. There's no metaphysical incompatibility with an internal intent to do something harmful to the church and the ability to receive jurisdiction. You see, so on that basis alone, the material pope thesis falls down.
I mean, also, it seems to me that it's fundamentally like you said, a Protestant ecclesiology. There's this divorce between the matter and the form, a kind of separation between the temporal and the spiritual. I mean, this is pretty much what happened at the Reformation. This idea that the church is merely a spiritual, gathering of the redeemed versus an institutional. The Catholic position being that it's a communion of both, of heaven and earth. It's sacramental, and for the sacraments to be valid, you need both jurisdiction. You need jurisdiction, and the grace flows through that juridical structure. So, I mean, it really is a kind of split of the sacramental understanding of the church as a whole. St. Robert Bellarmine would be spinning in his grave. But
Yes.
so
That's
I'm not,
exactly right, Dom. Because for
yeah.
me, it was just like the Eucharist. It was like saying, well, we can have a spiritual Eucharist without the bread. And that
Yeah.
was what it seemed like to me. It's like we can have a papacy without the man, without Peter.
Mhm.
And how do you have a functional papacy without a man doing the governing, teaching, and sanctifying? Just like how
Mhm.
can you have the Eucharist without the substance, the bread there to churn and change into the physical body, blood of Christ? It's the same kind of argumentation. The whole system just falls apart.
Yeah, and there's actually, I'm sure we'll get into this, but a lot of ironies when it comes to their rejection of the collegiality of the Second Vatican Council, because their position, in a sense, is a type of collegiality, but it's an erroneous one, and that erroneous type of collegiality takes place because they reject the collegiality taught at Vatican II. But before we get into that, I just want to say, so my transition away from the society and just certain traditionalist mindsets in general, it was really theological for me, not juridical and like canonical. So I'm here to learn from both of you when it comes to canon law and like the history of the society. So I kind of want to veer the conversation in the direction of, okay, where did all this start? Were they correct when Archbishop Lefebvre consecrated the bishops? Was he like in a state of necessity? Can we maybe tackle that issue and open up the history of the society?
Yeah, we can go to the very beginning, which is what I did. Although
Hmm.
I did start in my own journey with reviewing correspondence between Cardinal Ratzinger and Archbishop Lefebvre and John Paul II.
Hmm.
After I started having questions, I reviewed that correspondence, and I was really, frankly, shocked by the way Archbishop Lefebvre treated Cardinal Ratzinger and the Holy Father. Rome was bending over backwards trying to give Lefebvre everything he wanted. And a lot of people don't know this, but John Paul II was giving Archbishop Lefebvre one society priest to be consecrated on August 15th. That was a done deal. Archbishop Lefebvre agreed to that orally and in writing, and then reneged upon it and said, I need 3 more 6 weeks earlier. For what? For what? Talk about the imprudence of that. Okay. So that disturbed me when I saw how Rome was attempting to conciliate him and try to accommodate him in a reasonable way, and he wanted nothing to do with it. But this goes all the way back, to when the society was founded in 1970. And we could spend a lot of time on that, but I think those in the society should know that the Society of St. Pius X was formed under the 17 Code of Canon Law as a pious union. At least that's what the decree from Bishop Charrier says. It was formed as a pious union, which is a lay association that has no juridic personality under the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And the Society's own statutes acknowledge that it's a pious union with the primary purpose of forming laymen into priests. That's what the Society ultimately was formed in 1970. Now the society will say they were actually formed as a society of common life, a priestly society of common life. It makes no difference though. The reason why they say that is because when the local bishops suppressed them, the society argued that because they were a society of common life, suppression had to come from the apostolic see and not the local bishop. And ultimately what happened, guys, is not only did the Apostolic See suppress the society, but Pope Paul VI adopted the suppression in forma specifica, which means he made the act his own. But it's important to note a couple things. The society was formed as a pious union, a lay association on an ad experimentum basis, which means a temporary provisional basis. It had a canonical shelf life. It was only formed for a period of 6 years, after which time it had no further right to exist unless its status would have been renewed by Rome. The third point is that the society was never a juridic person capable of receiving priests through incarnation. If you read its own statutes say that the society is completely dependent upon the local bishop who decreed its status, and that priests would be formed in the society, but then incarnated into the dioceses. The society was not formed as a particular church or personal prelature or any other juridic personality capable of receiving priests through incarnation. And so even if we say they were unlawfully suppressed and this, that, and the other thing, the bottom line is it was a provisional organization that had a canonical shelf life that expired in 1976, period. It had no more juridical personality. It was juridically extinct, if it even had one in the beginning, which is debatable. So what I'm trying to explain to people is whether Archbishop Lefebvre was mistreated, and I don't believe he was, but whether he was really suspended and whether the society was lawfully suppressed or not, none of that is relevant to the fact that the Society of St. Pius X does not have a canonical status in the church. It never could incarnate priests. It never had a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, and it never had a mission to operate on its own, much less throughout the world, which it does today.
Interesting. Real quick for the audience, could you define incarnation?
Yes, incarnation means being hinged to or attached to a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. Under Canon 265 of the Code, and this was the same in the 17 Code, a priest ordained to the sacred priesthood cannot exercise any priestly powers unless he is incarnated. That is, unless he is under a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. Can't even say Mass or preach or baptize. And so because the Society of St. Pius X priests are not incarnated, they do not have faculties to say Mass. They do not have faculties to preach or baptize. These are sacrileges, frankly. And again, this is part of the divine constitution of the church. Priests serve the bishop serves the pope serves Christ, and jurisdiction comes from Christ down through the bishops and the clergy.
Okay, I see. So, I mean, basically the conclusion, it sounds like is basically that the SSPX is not part of the church or the Catholic Church. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I mean, Cardinal Raymond Burke said that in May of 2021. He made it clear, quoting him, he says the Society of St. Pius X is not part of the one Roman Catholic Church throughout the world, end quote. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that they're not a juridical person, number one, because they were formed as a pious union, which expired in 76. It technically expired in 75 when they were suppressed. But whether they were lawfully suppressed or not, they went out of existence. They don't have the juridic personality, so they're not part of the juridical structure of the church. In fact, the society's so-called negotiations with Rome, the purpose of that was to get a juridical status, was to become a personal prelature, which is one of the entities, canonical entities, if you will, that would allow a priest to be incarnated. A particular church or a personal prelature are one of the 3 or 4 types of entities where incarnation can occur. That's what they've been seeking. Now, how can the society say they have a mission when they've acknowledged that they don't have a mission but are seeking one? See,
fascinating.
So
yeah,
that's fundamentally what Cardinal Burke meant. They're not a juridic person within the Catholic Church, and hence they have no mission.
So is this basically what it means when we say that they're in an irregular status?
Well, technically, they have no status. If you had a map of the Catholic Church, the Society of St. Pius X wouldn't be on the map.
Yeah.
Even when they were formed as a pious union, a lay association is not on the canonical map. It has no, what we say, juridic personality. Even if it were a society of common life, which would have it, expired, either was suppressed or expired, however you want to look at it. So they're not on the geographical map of the Catholic Church. What they are is a loose confederation of vagus clergy. That's all they are, and who are technically non-Catholic ministers because they're not in the Roman Catholic Church.
I see.
Yeah, many people don't realize that you have regular and irregular, and like John is saying, irregular means not regular. It means that they are outside of the regula, outside of the rule of that common structure. And that's why it's kind of interesting, because it almost seems like a lot of people identify as trads and who attend SSPX, they seem to think that this is almost part of the whole perfect and imperfect communion. They think because they're viewing things through this certain narrative within the traditionalist movement that, oh, you've got like different you've got different cups of water, and each one is filled up differently, and that's how communion works. So you have, you might have a high Anglican who might have a more full cup than, a Baptist over here, and you have different degrees. And so then they apply that same reasoning to irregular and irregular status, almost as though, oh, well, we're all actually on the same map, but we just have different degrees that we adhere to that. And that's actually not the case. And one thing I'd actually like to hear John speak to, because I hear it all the time, I'm sure John has as well, and that is, how can the Pope recognize the confessions, allow marriages, and even work with the Sspx in tribunals? I think even Bishop Foyer was made a canonical minister of the second instance at one point. I think he was even given permission to ordain priests. How does that work with them being outside of the normal canonical structures? And what do you think of this reasoning that it's not possible for you to be able to receive those privileges and be outside the Catholic Church?
Real quick, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to, before I lose it, just wanted to address something that Andrew brought up, because this came up in a previous episode of the show. I was rebutting a video from an SSPX apologist, and they brought up that idea of communion being like different amounts of communion points, you might say. I just wanted to specify, I mean, if you look at, for example, the bishops in Germany, they're technically still in communion. And we talked about this, Andrew, a bit, with the difference between canonical schism and the moral sin of schism. So I would say communion isn't a question of quantity, but it is definitely a question of quality. So I just wanted to add that because it ties into a previous episode. But that being said, John, go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, what I've learned, in a deep dive with this is if information is coming from the society, I don't trust it. I challenge it, because I have found, my articles speak for themselves. I have found many cases where there's been, in my opinion anyway, outright deception. If Bishop Foyer says that he has received permission to ordain priests, then prove it. Then produce the document that corroborates the statement. What better thing to do to serve the traditional movement? Okay, that would be incredible. But the reality is, if they're all suspended ad divinis, not part of the Catholic Church, without a canonical mission, there's no possible way that is true. The only thing we know for a fact is that Pope Francis has delegated faculties for confessions and provisionally for marriages. And Archbishop Pozo has indicated why that is. When he was asked, does that mean should we go to the society? Archbishop Pozo, who was the point person for trying to reconcile the society back with the church, said, no, that's not what Pope Francis is trying to do. Pope Francis was concerned with the salvation of those who are attending SSPX chapels, not having their mortal sins forgiven. This has been an issue that's been going on for decades, and it was an act of mercy on the part of the Pope that the priests would have faculties in order to absolve these penitents and to have valid marriages with the permission of the local bishop. It was purely an act of mercy. Again, Cardinal Burke called it an anomaly, but still it was an act of mercy. In no way does that justify a worldwide mission by which they can do everything they want with impunity. That's not what it means. The fact that they have delegated faculties is all it means for specific acts. And by the way, when Pope Francis dies, I think that means the delegated faculties go away unless they're renewed by the next pope. And so it's still a precarious situation. And I would also say what makes it even more anomalous, and I've written about this and I haven't had anybody rebut it, is their Sunday masses don't fulfill the obligation. So we have people that are going to confessions there, but at the same time, they're not fulfilling their obligation. Now, God knows what their culpability is, but I'm saying, at least in the objective order, the fact that the Society of St. Pius X is not a church sui juris under canon law, in union with the bishop and in full communion with Rome, means that even though it says a valid liturgical rite, that right in and of itself does not satisfy the obligation. So it's an extremely problematic situation, and we hope it's going to be resolved at some point.
Now you got booted from writing articles at 1 Peter 5 for holding that stance, I think, didn't you, John?
I don't know the exact reason, but I sense that they were getting a lot of heat because those who attempted to jump in and defend the society did such a horrible job. This was quite embarrassing to the society. Now, a number of us reached out directly to the society to gauge their priests to write rebuttals to our articles. After all, we're mere laymen, right? You're priests, you're trained. Why don't you come and defend tradition and show us where we're wrong? But when the society replied that they were not going to engage in the debate, that's when they decided to stop the debate.
Okay. Well, I think a good transition here would be to talk about collegiality. And I also want to get to the Novus Ordo Missae. But first of all, my question is, what did the Second Vatican Council teach on collegiality? Is it in conformity with tradition? And what is it that the society rejects in that teaching?
Sure. Collegiality is one of the most beautiful doctrines of the council. In fact, Cardinal Bio had called collegiality a most clear dogma of the faith. What Vatican II taught at collegiality was the same thing that the Council Fathers actually taught in their schemas at Vatican I. And it's what you'll find in all theology manuals leading up to Vatican II. And that is that Christ, when we refer to the church and the magisterium of the church, what we mean is that Christ established by divine constitution two offices: the office of the primacy of the Pope and the office of the episcopacy. The Pope has universal and supreme jurisdiction by virtue of the primacy of the office, and he holds it singly. The episcopacy means that the College of Bishops collectively share in the Pope's supreme and universal jurisdiction, but not his primacy. You see? So the College of Bishops do not share in the primacy, but they share collectively, not individually, but collectively in the supreme jurisdiction, the universal power of the Pope. This is based in Revelation. It's based on Matthew chapter 18, where Christ tells the apostolic college, whatever you bind or loose on earth is bound or loosed in heaven. The society rejects the truth that the College of Bishops share in the supreme universal jurisdiction and authority of the Pope. And one of the reasons why they reject it is because they err by conflating the primacy with supremacy or supreme jurisdiction. You can read that in the writings. I've written an article on this. Robert Sisko has as well. They specifically conflate the primacy with supreme jurisdiction. They're two separate things. The bishops do not share at all in the primacy. That's why it's called the primacy, okay? But they do share collectively in the supreme authority of the church. This is, for example, how bishops can participate in an ecumenical council as judges. They're not just consultors, which is what the society thinks they are. No, if you read the theology manuals on this, guys, I'm telling you, it's crystal clear. They act as judges by virtue of the fact that they're a member of the episcopacy, the College of Bishops, united to their head, externally united to their head. And so this is one of the things that the society rejects. The other thing that the society claims the council teaches, which is completely false, is it claims that Lumen Gentium 22 teaches that a bishop receives his jurisdiction upon his episcopal consecration. That is not what Lumen Gentium teaches. And if you read the Nota Previa to Lumen Gentium, it teaches just the opposite. It makes a distinction between the office or the office that the bishop receives upon the laying on of hands, okay, and then the power that he is licitly able to carry out the function when he receives what's called a canonical determination or canonical mission. There's a distinction between the matter, which is the laying on of hands, the episcopal consecration. It gives the episcopal character to the man, and the form, which is jurisdiction that comes from the Pope by virtue of the fact that the Pope has now given him a canonical mission. And the society falsely states that Lumen Gentium says he gets the jurisdiction upon episcopal consecration, which is not true. And yet I've heard one priest after another superficially state that without quoting the document, without proving it at all. It's mind-boggling. And I said this before, I cannot believe the society has gotten away with these arguments for so long. It's as if nobody really looked into these matters in detail.
Yeah. No, I mean, let's see. There's a bit of an echo here. Okay, I think it's good. Yeah, I mean, collegiality is another thing. I mean, especially this idea that, if I'm not mistaken, the munera of the bishop, they come from his ordination, but for him to licitly use those gifts of his office, he needs to be in communion with the sign of community, which is the Roman Pontiff. But this opens up this new, you might say, emphasis or focus or clarification, opens up possibility for ecumenical dialogue with our Eastern Orthodox separated brothers and sisters. And that's another thing, is like ecumenism is almost completely absent in the Society of St. Pius X. But the church, which is kind of ironic because the church has a mission to evangelize and the society lacks that mission, and you see no ecumenical work in the society. So
and yet they're the beneficiaries, but yet the society is the beneficiaries of ecumenism because the Pope has allowed them to hear confessions and witness marriages, and they're outside the Catholic Church. So they're benefiting from ecumenical activities of the Holy See.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, man. Okay, so I am learning a lot of things here. I wanted to transition into Vatican II in general. Before we do that, John, would you mind talking about some errors on sacramental intention? You mentioned that last time we talked.
Well, you can read Archbishop Lefebvre's many writings on this. I mean, his letter to confused Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
What Archbishop Lefebvre says is that the priest must intend the sacramental effect. That is a grave error. That is an error that has been condemned by the Holy Office twice under the pontificate of Pius IX in the late 1800s. You can read all about it. It's funny, I even talked to seminarians and priests in the society who said, yeah, we were taught about those condemnations. Do you know what Archbishop Lefebvre said? He said just the opposite. If you read his book, he says if a priest believes in transsignification or some other heretical concept of the Eucharist, he doesn't confect the sacrament. He doesn't consecrate. That's almost heretical. The church has always taught all effectively that you need for a valid sacrament is you need intent, but intent is evinced in the external form by using proper matter and proper form. If the priest is saying the Mass and he uses proper matter and proper form, he's deemed to have the proper intention. It doesn't matter what he believes about the sacrament. In fact, one of the Holy Office cases that I'm referring to was a Methodist minister who, prior to the baptism, publicly confessed to the congregation, I do not believe that baptism washes away original sin. It only incorporates one into the church, but it does not wash away original sin. That was a dubia that was posed to the Holy Office. You know what the Holy Office said? The baptism was still valid. So here is a case, and that's because he used proper matter and form. He did what the church does. He didn't do what the church intends, but he did what the church does. Right? He used water and he said the Trinitarian formula, and he had a concept that this was a rite of Christian initiation, you see. And so there's an example of somebody who's actually denying the sacramental effect, and the church says, no, it doesn't matter. So Archbishop Lefebvre was gravely in error on this matter. And, I trace all of these concepts of whether the Novus Ordo sacraments are valid or not. Are they dubious? This all comes from the errors of Lefebvre. He started this. I mean, he perpetuated this. And now you actually have good, honest, traditional Catholics who thinks that the Novus Ordo sacraments are of doubtful validity, not understanding truly what the church teaches, but only hearing what Archbishop Lefebvre and the society say.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I mean, that's a question that's been brought up to me many times by friends and family and acquaintances, which is, does the person administering the sacrament need to have the intention to do what the church does? And so questions of, Protestant baptisms came up. And so I usually didn't have an answer for that question, but it seems to me that you don't need to have the intention to affect the sacrament in the way the Catholic Church understands it. You need to have both the matter and form and the idea that this is a Christian sign. Is that correct?
Well, you need the intent. I'm not saying it's just matter and form. You need the intention.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that the church doesn't judge internals. And so if matter and valid form are used, you have the requisite intention in the external form. if that priest interiorly withholds the intent to consecrate, it would be invalid, but nobody would know about it. You know,
So the
it's funny
effects would
that
be
the consecrator of Archbishop Lefebvre, I think when he was ordained a priest, admitted on his deathbed that he withheld the intention, which was striking. So, you know, it wasn't clear, and I don't want to get into this and make this a controversy, but I bring that up because the Society of St. Pius X, in defense of Archbishop Lefebvre's priestly ordination, in defense of it, actually explains sacramental intention perfectly. They explain it perfectly, okay? But when it comes to the Novus Ordo sacraments, there was no doubt of validity with Archbishop Lefebvre's priestly ordination, but there is a doubt with respect to Novus Ordo ordinations because all the bishops are modernists. You see, that's not what the church, that's not what the church says.
Andrew, do you want to jump in? Because I have just a couple more questions here, and then we'll surely have some questions in the chat.
Sure. Is there anything you wanted me to address or
yeah, fair enough. Well, let's see. Maybe talk more about the sociological, you know, the lack of interaction with the larger church, the concept of rival altar, and that kind of attitude. You know what I mean?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think a really big part of what opened my eyes, because being raised in this movement, I believed that I was part of the remnant church. As a second generation traditionalist, I had been raised to see the what we called the Novus Ordo Church, or what Archbishop Lefebvre called the Conciliar Church, as a separate church. And you can find quote after quote after quote from Archbishop Lefebvre, from the bishops that he consecrated, from the various clergy, that it's a separate church. It's a conciliar church. And he even went so far as to use very, very extreme and even vulgar language about this when talking about their sacraments. He called them bastard priests, bastard sacraments, and he believed that the churchmen had actually aligned themselves with a false mistress, you might say, which was the conciliar church. It was very, very extreme, but it was very obvious that he, while believing, you know, but that was this contradiction, is he wanted to hold on to kind of the structures. He couldn't let go of the papacy, even though he flirted with sedevacantism on a few occasions. But at the same time, he practically recognized that, and that's what John was talking about earlier. There's this separation between their speculative and practical use or positions on this subject. So they want to have the structures, but at the same time, their practical day-to-day life, they act like the Roman Catholic Church is a separate church. And that's what I came to realize, was that, wow, we actually do see this as a separate church. And then when the society split, and the Dominicans of Avrillé that I received formation under, both in my high school education, and I was also a postulant there, discerning a Dominican vocation. They sided with Bishop Richard Williamson, and the resistance priests. And there were quite a few resistance priests. And I think there would have even been a lot more if the society hadn't done damage control and there hadn't been so many priests who were afraid of leaving the Sspx because of not knowing exactly, you know, how they're going to feed themselves and different things like that. But I knew there were a lot. And even with the ones that didn't leave, there were still way more priests. I mean, it's the biggest split that's ever happened in the Sspx, was the split of 2012. And so many of these priests that left, I had grown up with, I'd received spiritual direction from. I knew they were hardcore priests. These priests were faithful to Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's life and teachings. And so I had a choice. I said, okay, well, who do I go with? Do I go with the resistance, or do I go with the resistance to the resistance? And then it struck me that, well, why do I feel like I've seen this before? Isn't this why my parents originally left Protestantism and became Catholic? Is because there are all these factions all vying for the position of being the true Church of Christ, the true remnant, but they all differ in these fundamental, and you can't really tell which is the true church, because some of them have one thing, some of them have the other. And I said, okay, oh boy, it looks like this is happening all over again. And this flows from this false Protestant ecclesiology that John talked about. So for me, it really was a practical, okay, now I've got a choice. I've got to choose between this SSPX or this SSPX, or I can choose between state of Contism, or I can maybe reconsider and say, well, maybe I'm prejudiced. Maybe I have been raised a good little anti-Catholic, and the church isn't as evil as I thought it was. And as I delved into the church, I realized so many of the things I've been told about Pope St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, about the Second Vatican Council, about the Reformed rites of sacraments, they were false. They were wrong. And I have met, I can't tell you how many fervent Catholics who pray. I mean, they pray on a daily basis. They have a high level of holiness, who are being nurtured by the Reformed sacraments following the Second Vatican Council. And that was another huge part for me, was realizing that Michael Davies, who wrote 3 volumes in defense of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, actually differed with the Archbishop about whether or not the new Mass, as it was promulgated, was harmful to your faith. I was like, that's a really big thing to differ with the Archbishop on, especially being one of his foremost apologists.
Andrew, it's funny. I was a postulant in Avrillé as well, and
Were you seriously?
Ways. Yeah, and we parted ways when I admitted that I was attending the Institute of Christ the King during the week. They said, "Sorry, you don't qualify." I said, "Happy. I'm glad to depart from you." You know. But,
wow, yeah.
You know, you're right about the conciliar church. Whenever I talk to somebody about this and they refer to the Novus Ordo Church or the conciliar church, I stop them and I say, when you say conciliar church, you are referring to the Roman Catholic Church, correct? You're referring to the Church of Rome and all of the churches that are legally united to her, correct? Is that what you're referring to? The church that has a pope and bishops. That's when you say conciliar church, you're referring to that church, correct? I mean, get them, you know, Pius X talked about how the modernists use terminology to confuse Catholics, but it's the trads that are doing this as well. They're using terminology in a way that you have to get them to define what they mean. So if the conciliar church is the Roman Catholic Church, and they have to admit that that's what they mean because there's only one church with a pope and an episcopacy, then what church do you belong to? And as I said they belong to the church of those who simply profess the true faith. And by professing the true faith, what they really mean is those who attend the old Mass and who reject Vatican II and the new Mass. This is what I have called in my articles the false church of tradition. This is the counter church of tradition. I believe this is the sign of the great apostasy. And it's not just the old traditionalists that have fallen victim to this. All these Novus Ordo converts that have come to tradition know even less than some of the older, more seasoned traditionalists, and they're falling hook, line, and sinker for these errors. Oh yeah, being a true Catholic means just professing the true faith. I got the old Mass and the true faith. That's how they define the Roman Catholic Church. Read any of the Protestant documents and how they revolted against the church. They say exactly the same thing.
It's uncanny. Andrew and I keep noticing how uncanny all these similarities with the Society of St. Pius X, the Donatists, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin. It's incredible. And you're right. There's all these new Catholics, these new converts. They discover the beauty of the 1962 and they're enamored. And I mean, rightfully so. It's a beautiful Mass, obviously. I mean, as I'm sure everyone here, we grew up with it. I mean, John, you joined later the traditionalist movement. But the point being is that, and this is kind of what Francis is on about, is that something good and beautiful is being used as a weapon to promote a dissenting attitude and a ecclesiology that is not traditional. So it's the irony of ironies, really, that in the name of tradition, they've become modernists. And so it's deeply ironic.
That was one of the things that struck me when I read Pascendi, Pope St. Pius X's encyclical on modernism, after I left the SSPX, because as I was reading his descriptions, I could not help but see Archbishop Lefebvre and the priests and many of the other, state of Contis and other clergy using the exact same methodologies, the exact same lines of argumentation. And the other thing that just blew me away was that growing up in traditionalism, right, we see tradition versus modern, traditionalism versus modernism, true church versus false church. And so if you ask any traditionalist Catholic, what is the answer to modernism, they will tell you tradition. But that's not the answer that Pope St. Pius X gave. He said that the only remedy for modernism is submission to the holy magisterium of the Catholic Church. And that just blew me away.
Do you know when Pope Boniface in Unum Sanctum said that is absolutely necessary for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff? You guys know what that actually means? Because I know a lot of trads don't. What it means is you must be subject to your local bishop. It's by virtue of you being in subjection to your local bishop that you are then you're subject to the Roman pontiff. You see, the society clergy are not subject to the Roman pontiff, not only because of their actions, they've effectively in practice have repudiated his authority, but because they're not in communion with the local bishop, they're not in subjection to the Roman pontiff. And they can't be saved in that. I mean, if unum sanctum means what it says, they cannot be saved. That's how grievous the situation really is. They are not subject to the Roman pontiff.
Yeah. Let's see. So one thing that I've noticed online, I mean, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but there is definitely like a wave of just angry and very schismatic attitude online, but also, as we all know, like in real life as well, in real persons. So, for example, just on my channel, I have some traditionalists who comment on some of my videos critiquing the SSPX, and the language that is used is your mass, your Novus Ordo pews, your this, your that, as if it's not ours. And what that does, it's literally the creation, if not on paper, for the SSPX, even on paper, but the creation of a rival altar, a rival Eucharist, a rival communion, and that's just like you said, John. I mean, schism leads to hell. You need to be careful, and so it's a real danger. Yeah,
and what you see is when you leave the church, you end up then attacking the church. Okay, you've committed a mortal sin against faith, hope, and charity. That's the problem. And so it's very common. I saw this with Sede Vacantis for years, but even now, unfortunately, with traditional Catholics who have effectively refused communion with Novus Ordo Catholics and with Pope Francis and the bishops, they not only have withdrawn submission, but now they're attacking Holy Mother Church. This is so common. I try to stay away from, these comment boxes and things like that, but I've been told that there is such a bitter spirit right now among so-called traditional Catholics. I call them false traditionalists. They're members of this false church of tradition, but attacking Holy Mother Church, not praying for the bishops and the Pope, not in a spirit of charity, but in a spirit of bitterness. And it's really sad, but that is a telltale sign of someone who is in darkness, someone whose heart is becoming hardened because they've left Holy Mother Church, the fountain of grace, and now have become her enemy. And again, this is what makes this so serious. We're ultimately talking about salvation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, let's see. We're at an hour and 3 minutes. If you need to go, John, just let us know. I don't want to take too much of your time. But the next question I had is a pretty broad one, but it has to do with the so-called errors in the Second Vatican Council in general. Do you or Andrew or both of you want to speak on that?
How many traditional Catholics say, you got to reject Vatican II, but they haven't read any of the documents? I mean, seriously. And, when I watched the Society's crisis series, and I watched most of those videos in depth, I was so surprised at their superficial treatment of the council. First of all, the Society's position, and by the way, Archbishop Lefebvre signed all of the documents. It's been reported that he did say the new mass, before he flip-flopped on the council, and he flip-flopped on the new mass, and he flip-flopped on collegiality and everything else. I mean, his whole career was one of flip-flopping.
Even religious liberty. Yeah.
Religious liberty, that too. But they claim that Vatican II positively teaches error and even heresy. For example, they call collegiality a heresy, but then they don't quote the documents. They'll quote a statement from John Paul II or Benedict XVI 40 years later, and based on that statement say that, see how bad the documents are. We'll quote the documents. I mean, Archbishop or Bishop Foyer, I think it's still on the Society's website, where he even says publicly 95% of what's in the council documents is just fine. It's 5%. That's still on the Society website. And yet they did a crisis series of podcasts where they indicted the council. There's a difference between saying that the magisterium positively taught error and saying that some of the statements in the conciliar texts are ambiguous and can be interpreted, either in a traditional or non-traditional way. I mean, as I've been writing, unlike the Society's position, which again, because they're outside the church, they have to attack the church, the Catholic approach has always been to interpret the magisterium in the most favorable light, her documents, give her the benefit of the doubt. This is the teaching of Pius VI, I believe it was, Auctorum Fide, where he said the presumption is with the magisterium that they're teaching an orthodox manner, and what has to happen is you have to reject the heterodox interpretation of an ambiguous statement. Okay, that's the Catholic approach, and you can do that. It's very difficult sometimes, particularly with religious liberty. And I've studied these documents, guys, for 20 years. I've read them all, and I've read them all in detail in many different translations. And it's difficult in some cases, but the Society's position is just the opposite. They start with the a priori presumption that there's error in the document, and then use that, as well as the new Mass, then to beat up the church, to justify their own existence outside the church, which I think is the real motivation.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that distinction between positive error and maybe a lack of clarity, or maybe a imprudent pastoral or disciplinary decision. Or I mean, like, look at Nicaea 1. I brought this up several times. Nicaea 1 is very ambiguous over the divinity of the Holy Spirit. And in fact, they had to affirm that in Nicaea 2. I mean, at Trent, this is a common example. The understanding of what tradition is, it's very ambiguous. Pope Pius XII, when he defined the Assumption, he's ambiguous about the end of Mary's life, because we have not yet decided in theology whether she died or not. And has it been used sometimes for ill purposes? I mean, Nicaea 1, the ambiguity over the divinity of the Holy Spirit was because of a strand of heresy in the church. So, it's a like we say, a negative charism of infallibility. It's, indefectibility means nothing positive of error will be taught. And I mean, if you apply this same attitude towards Vatican II to other councils, I mean, you end up saying what Luther said, which is all the councils contradicted themselves, and you become Protestant, which is in fact what happened.
The Society is nothing special here. Okay, I can go back to many other examples. Most recently, the old Catholics after Vatican I, they rejected Vatican I's teaching on papal infallibility and pastor eternus. Guess what happens? They split from the church. They consecrated their own bishop. They're still around, right? Yeah. So there probably is in some of their sects valid orders, but of course they're schismatic and heretics and operating illicitly. It's the same thing with the Society. They left after the council, just like the old Catholics did. They're in the same basket as the old Catholics. There's no difference.
Yeah, the resemblances once again are replete. Let's see. Unless anybody wants to add anything, I would like to transition into the new Mass, because I mean, as we all know, I mean, it's pretty public that the Society's position is that in the rubrics of the new Mass, not abuses, but the rubrics themselves, there exists a poison, again, a positive error, right? A poison of Protestant heresy that is harmful to souls. Therefore, you do not have to attend Mass to fulfill your Sunday obligation if the traditional Latin Mass is not available. This is deeply problematic. Can we maybe talk about that? Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, certainly. So many people in the Sspx don't seem to be quite aware of this, and I actually had a guy stop me in Home Depot the other day because he recognized me from the debate, and we really got into this, and he thought that it was unfair what I said about the local Sspx pastor, that if I went to him and said, should I attend the Novus Ordo Mass, that he would say no. And I said, well, does your pastor depart from the Society's official stance on this? And he wasn't sure. He was a little bit confused about that. I said, you got to ask him, because it is part of the official position of the Sspx. They have published it, and It's public. You can find it in the Problem of the Liturgical Reform, which is put forward by the Sspx. You can find it in their videos, such as their Crisis City series, the books that they've published, questions frequently asked about the Sspx. Everywhere you go, you're going to find this. Not only that, but they've even put it into their prayer books. In the spiritual warfare book that they publish, in the examination of conscience, you can find in there, have I attended a Novus Ordo Missae? So this is truly a part of an essential part of the SSPX narrative, and it's rotten to the core. And as I've pointed out, when you have a schism, there is this separation. That's what schism means. It's a separation. And one of the first things that's going to happen is you're going to stop worshiping with your fellow Catholics. And that's because there's a fundamental connection between mission and apostolic authority and the Mass. I mean, at the end of the Mass, right, in the Latin, it's ite missa est, right? The Mass, the word Mass itself comes from this mission, right? There's this connection between the Eucharistic sacrifice, which is the sacrament of unity and of charity, and the exercise of apostolic authority and mission. And so it's only natural that the SSPX would eventually move into this point where they, not only that, as Salza has pointed out, they even tell you not to attend traditional Latin masses according to the same 1962 missal, because they accept the Second Vatican Council, they accept the Novus Ordo Missae. I mean, that's shocking.
I've seen that too. Yeah, I've seen that too. Yeah, like if you go to the fraternity, you're a traitor. I mean, the turf wars, right? But yeah, you cannot go to the institute. You cannot go to the fraternity. You cannot go to what are they called? The good pastor priests. Yeah, it's because there is a severance, and for all practical purposes, a severance of worship, of communion in worship with the rest of the Catholic Church. That is what schism is. Sure, there's no canonical at this point. It was lifted, right? Sanction of schism. But as you said several times, Andrew, schism is a canonical and a moral problem. And what we have here is a manifestation of the moral, transgression of schism in certain groups that is available to see objectively without judging intentions or whatever. So, yeah. So, what would you guys make about these charges of Bunini being a Freemason and the offertory being butchered and basically the Mass being a cesspool of heresy?
It's outrageous. I mean, I've read Jungmann. I've studied the evolution of the Roman Rite all the way through the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, and I can tell you that all of the elements of the Novus Ordo have been around for centuries. The offertory, the bringing up of the gifts, the prayers of the faithful, all of these things are extremely traditional elements. And so there's nothing wrong with the rite itself. It's the accidental elements, okay, that make it problematic. And I would like people to understand that they should view this in light of the passion of Christ, because we are suffering a passion in the church right now. The passion of Christ was completely disfigured during his passion, right? And yet he remained God. Accidents mean what appears in Thomistic metaphysics, right? The accidents or the accidental elements are the appearances of something, whereas the substance is what the thing actually is. It's its quiddity, what it actually is. So Christ, in his passion, the accidental elements, he appeared as a completely disfigured man. I mean, he even said, all of you will be scandalized in me. That's what's going on in the church right now. People are being scandalized because of the accidental elements. The accidental elements of the Novus Ordo and of Vatican II and of the traditional movement, those are the elements that have deceived Catholics into leaving the Catholic Church, just as the accidental elements of Christ's crucifixion scandalized everybody and deceived everybody that he really wasn't true God and true man, you see? But the substance of what's there, the substance of Christ's deity, of him being truly God and truly man, the substance of the rite, of the validity of the consecration, that's what matters. And when people recognize the distinction between the accidents and the substance, don't be deceived by the accidents. If the church is truly suffering a passion right now, would we not expect there to be aberrations in the liturgy and in doctrine, at least on the accidental level? Wouldn't we expect this? Just as Christ was hanging on the cross and only Our Lady and a few others were there, wouldn't we expect the same thing in our parishes where there's ugliness and horrible music and all these other accidental elements that are repugnant, and yet it's truly the sacrifice of Christ reenacted on that altar? That's what's going on right now. The church is suffering the passion, and Catholics have been deceived by the accidents because they're so repugnant. They've lost faith in what actually is, that this truly is the Roman Catholic Church, that she is suffering her passion, that she is wounded, that she is disfigured, but we, like Our Lady, have to remain at the foot of the cross. I think if we put it in that context, it's helpful, and then we don't feel like we're taking this burden on ourselves. What God is permitting here is what he permitted to happen to his only son. And of course, the Holy Mother Church follows her head. It follows the Son. That's what we're experiencing right now. So I think that, without being too spiritual, for me anyway, helps me persevere, not in just faith, but in intellect and understanding what's going on before us.
Yeah,
It helps you.
Go ahead, Andrew.
It helps you get through on eagle's wings.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I heard that. I attend the ICK, but yeah, I believe it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this goes back to what you said about positive error, right? I mean, if you look at the history of the liturgy, you were talking about young men. I mean, Fortescue and Ratzinger. I mean, if you look at the history of the liturgy, yes, there's times when certain reforms, implementations, interventions are done very poorly, are done, probably imprudently, but it's always within a providential plan, right? And so it's like, the church cannot legislate something in its liturgical discipline, because lex orandi, lex credendi, right? That will be harmful to the faith of those who go to mass, to the faithful. I mean, that is to say that the church can defect and feed poison in matters of doctrine and worship, right? I mean, Kongar talks about the liturgy being one of the vehicles of the transmission of capital T tradition. And if you're going to say that it is transmitting heresy, the church has in fact defected. So it's just, there's no nuanced approach to this, which is that, yes, you can have qualms about liturgy. Heck, Andrew knows I have a lot of qualms about both the Novus Ordo Missae and less about the 962, but still there too. I mean, if you read Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy, it's a quite incredible book that talks about the need for reform. And the subsequent reforms also being, not the ideal reforms, but still the church is using God is using what the church is legislating in a providential plan. And you're right. Sometimes we have to suffer. So,
it's a test of faith. It is a test of faith. This right now is a test of faith. And those who are leaving the church and following clergy who are not part of or sent by the church are going to lose their faith because they're leaving the Roman Catholic Church. They're failing that test.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I really believe that modernism, traditionalism, progressivism, these ideological types are deep down the problem that was present before the council, which is why we needed the council, which is a lack of supernatural faith. We've become this bourgeois culture, this secular on the inside, following the rules on the outside. There's no supernatural eschatological horizon. And then the council tries to address that by saying, guys, it's not just about the rules. And so then the rules are removed and everybody goes crazy. The liturgy goes crazy. And it's like, no, you're missing the point. The problem is a lack of supernatural faith. So I really think that's what's going on the progressive side and on the radical traditional side. So, it's about sticking with the ship because the ship will not defect. It won't sink. So anyway, that was my little tangent there. But so we have some questions from the chat. John, if you need to go, feel free at any time to let us know. But I'm going to try and answer some of these. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Andy asks us a question for Andrew. How best to approach family/friends about this, especially when SSPX ideology has been hammered into them since birth? What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, that can be very difficult. So I actually came into the church a little while before the rest of my family did. It was actually 5 years until they actually also came back into full communion. And we discussed a lot of these issues.
Hmm.
And what I began to realize was that it's because we're humans, we're not Spocks, we're not just pure intellects. We're a mind and we're a heart. Even if you convince the head, if the heart isn't ready to go, if the heart isn't ready to follow, or the will, then they're going to still resist. They're going to come up with reasons, and the intellect is very adept at coming up with reasons for staying where it wants to stay. So the number one thing that you have to do is you have to pray for them. You have to pray that they receive the graces to soften their hearts. And then the second thing is live the example of Catholicism, of a truly authentic Catholicism. Let them see your joy. Let them see your peace. Let them see that you don't have that bitterness anymore, that constant negativity about what's going on in the church. And through your prayers and through your example, that's the number one thing that you can possibly do. If it comes up in conversation, then be prepared to give a good answer. And there are great resources. And John, for example, John Salza is doing a great job at True Pope, False Pope, getting into a lot of these issues. But also read the documents of the Second Vatican Council, encounter the beauty in there so that you'll be able to communicate that to others.
Wonderful. John, you have anything to say about that?
No, it's absolutely right. This is prayer and fasting. This is a spiritual war. And so we can propose all the intellectual arguments that we have, but ultimately, right, we're going to need the gift of the Holy Ghost and the grace to convert some of these hearts.
Yeah, amen. Let's see, Hannah Bartel. Hey, Hannah. She says, I appreciate what Dom said about something beautiful being used as a weapon in reference to the Society's use of the traditional Latin Mass. That's really powerful. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I've seen, unfortunately. And that's why I think Francis, although we can debate the prudence of the document, I mean, largely he's absolutely right. This is exactly what is taking place. But
Paul
that's
VI was
also
concerned about that too, Dom, actually. He did not
really.
want, Archbishop Lefebvre was actually using the traditional Mass as a banner for his version of Catholic traditionalism. And Paul VI was very concerned about that. And his concern was right, because as I said, now the traditional movement defines the Catholic faith by those who say the traditional Mass without regard to whether they're Catholic or not, you see. And so there is a danger there. And again, yes, we can question the prudence of trying to restrict it, but at the same time, we can understand the concerns, right? Of whether the traditional Mass has been weaponized by those who are using it as a justification to attack Holy Mother Church and attack her by saying all the other rites are wrong, all the sacraments are dubious. That's a problem.
Absolutely. Andy here, another question. Let's see. Doesn't the Council of Trent, which trads love to get behind, explicitly forbid bishops from carrying out functions in another bishop's diocese? John, that looks like it's for you.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the dogmatic decrees of Trent, which has an accompanying anathema, says that whoever says that bishops illicitly minister without being sent by ecclesiastical and canonical power, let him be anathema. That means this is a matter of the divine law. The church is anathematizing something that's contrary to the Catholic faith, which is even to say that a clergy is a legitimate Catholic minister who has not been sent by canonical power, you see?
Yeah.
And so that's fundamentally, I mean, some of the commentators on this have said, when a bishop enters into another bishop's diocese, it's like a brother bishop bringing a sickle to the harvest of his other bishop, right? This has always been prohibited within the church.
Gotcha. Okay, let's see. Andy's got one last question. Don't worry, Andy. We love questions. Let's see. How best to explain the difference between actual tradition carried on through the church and the externals of tradition, smells and bells? Yeah, I mean, this is really the crux of the issue, really. Andrew, I'll let you get a stab at that. We've kind of covered most of it, but any other musings?
Yeah, definitely. Well, of course, tradition, sacred tradition, has to do with that body of Catholic dogma and doctrine. And it includes, the church councils, it includes the fathers of the church, it includes the approved doctors, and includes this whole body of teaching and pastoral practice, as well as the liturgy. The liturgy is a very important part of that because there are certain essential elements in there. Those are things that are the substance, kind of similar to what John was talking about before. You have substance and you have accidents. And sacred tradition is the substance of Catholicism. It's what's been believed by all, everywhere, through all times. And the accidents of tradition are those traditional practices which you might say are an expression of that essence, an expression of that substance, but it's something that can change as the times change. And so you might have something that is appropriate for the 17th century, something that really expresses well the substance of this tradition for that time period. And then you might have something different for the 21st century or from the 11th century. Each one is going to have a slightly different way of giving expression to the essence that is sacred tradition. Would you concur with that, John?
Yeah, I would say, at the highest level, scripture and tradition fundamentally is what Christ revealed to the apostles or what the Holy Ghost revealed to the apostles. And it's what they then orally handed on. That's the highest form of tradition. But you're right, that's capital T. The small t then is the accumulation of the interpretation of that divine deposit, that deposit of faith that is carried out, through doctrinal teachings, liturgical expressions, prayers, etc. And I would say to the questioner that the difference is that authentic tradition only exists in the Roman Catholic Church. That's fundamentally what you have to keep in mind. It only exists in the Roman Catholic Church. And this is what Paul VI and John Paul II told Archbishop Lefebvre, and Cardinal Ratzinger, as Pope Benedict XVI, said the same thing. We have a group of clergy who are attempting to define tradition, but they're not in the church. It's only within the church that authentic tradition exists.
Yes, and I would just add two references. So first of all, when it comes to theologians, right, there's some that appeal to you more than other because there's different personalities, ways of writing. So I'm gonna say check out the book The Meaning of Tradition by Yves Kongar. Now, I'm much more of a Ratzinger and Balthazar fan. Kongar is a hit or miss for me personally, but that is an excellent work. So I would recommend that. And finally, read Dei Verbum. It's the shortest of the four constitutions. And read it carefully. Read it several times. And it talks about this at length. And it's a beautiful document. It's a pivotal and very important document. And so that's what I would say. Dei Verbum and The Meaning of Tradition by Yves Kongar. So let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see if I can read this one. Many will say Rome treats the SSPX as Catholic, so there is no big deal with it. How can you answer to this objection? And which way is Rome actually treating the SSPX as Catholic? In which way is she doing so? Does that make sense, the question? I'll throw it at you, John, if that's okay.
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to have to say who says that. What's the source? I have to cross-examine that. Yep. I can tell you in correspondence with the society, that's about the only thing that the society has replied to me is saying, you know what? We don't have any arguments or rebuttals to all your arguments. We know that we're Catholic. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it becomes the question of what does it mean to be Catholic? If you're saying that you do not have to be part of the Roman Catholic Church or sent by the Roman Catholic Church or have a canonical mission from the Roman Catholic Church, then your definition of Catholicism is different than what the church has held for 2,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And last question here. It's a very good one. Let's see. Also, they will say modernism is the real big deal right now. So Sedevacantists and SSPX and all traditionalism is really in the same Catholic team, so we don't have to fight it. So it's kind of this attitude that I've noticed of kind of banding together despite our traditionalist disagreements. But it seems to me that this is exactly the false ecumenism that the left is accused of, which is, the Sedes and the SSPX and the FSSP. Oh, we could all just come together because we have the same enemy, right? The modernists. But it's like there's some serious ecclesiological differences there, and that's kind of like a false ecumenism. So anyway, but why are we harping on the trads and not the modernists? Yeah. So Andrew, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and I noticed there was it looked like Fundamentum Veritatis. He seems to be a little bent out of shape that we are lumping Sedevacantism and the SSPX in the same boat, and the reason for that, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, is because they're just two sides of the same coin. Each one just has a different response, and this is something that they themselves recognize. Father Cicada. He pointed out that in the end, all traditionalists are Sedevacantists. They just haven't figured it out yet. So Archbishop Lefebvre acts, even though he recognizes, they say, oh, well, we pray for the Pope, we hang his picture up on the sacristy, we say his name in the Mass, all these things, therefore, we're not Sedevacantists. But then practically, in the day-to-day governance, they act as if there's no Pope. So how is that different from the Sedevacantists, right? At least the Sedevacantists are being honest, and their words are actually matching up with their actions. So that's the reason that we are putting them together, and we're talking about traditionalism and as a broad movement. So that involves Sedevacantists and traditionalists, but they all have the same Protestant. They all have the same Protestant ecclesiology.
Yeah, I agree. Let's see. So John, why are we talking about the trads and not modernists?
Because the errors on the traditionalist right are graver than the liberal errors on the left. And the reason why that is because the errors on the right, these errors lead you out of the Roman Catholic Church, outside of which there's no salvation. Okay. The liberal errors on the left, we know what they are. Universal salvation, horrible liturgies, religious liberty means worship how you want. These are grievous errors. But as St. Pius X said, modernists live in the hearts and veins of the church, and God's going to judge their culpability. But the errors on the traditionalist right actually lead these people outside of the Roman Catholic Church, and then they end up attacking Holy Mother Church. So they are outside, they've jumped off the ship. They're in a state of damnation. Okay, so and the other thing is, guys, these errors on the traditionalist right are more difficult to discern. We're talking about a lot of technical stuff that most Catholics really haven't had to deal with. So, as I said, the accidents are what deceives. When you see young priests in traditional cassocks saying reverent masses, preaching Christ the King, that all looks good on the accidental level. But what is the substance? You see, any error that leads you outside the Roman Catholic Church is the gravest error of all. And that's why, while modernism is the synthesis of all heresies, we're fighting that battle inside the Catholic Church. We're not fighting that battle outside the church, outside of which there's no salvation. That's the difference. That's why we can't band together with those outside the church. We need to bring them back in the church and fight the battle of modernism from within.
Yes. Awesome. Okay. Well, looks like we're at 1 hour and 32 minutes. Those questions that I have not addressed, don't worry. We'll be back on. We'll address them again. So in conclusion, maybe I could hand it over to Andrew. So what would be a conclusion when it comes to your understanding of the problems that the SSPX poses to the church today, and why we're doing this webinar, basically?
Yeah. Well, similar to what we talked about in our opening video for our series that we're going to be getting into the issues a little bit more, is that it is an ideology. Extreme radical traditionalism has become an ideology, just like modernism or any others, in that they have taken what is supposed to be a means of salvation and made it an end, which is very similar to idolatry. In idolatry, you take something and you put it in a place that it doesn't belong, out of its proper context, usually in the place of God, and it becomes central to everything that you talk about. And it just really strikes me how in the traditionalist Catholic movement, they are more adamant and they spend more time defending the Mass and talking about the Mass than they do about spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ, about growing in holiness, and it's not, of course, those things are talked about in the traditionalist Catholic movement, but that's not their public persona. That's not really the end of the movement. The end of the movement is to preserve the traditionalist Mass, or the 1962 Missal as they see it, and to also preserve these certain ways of viewing the church, either as a theological conception or even political conceptions. Because, of course, Archbishop Lefebvre was very, very tied into his time period of history. And there's a reason that many of his big donors and the people who supported him were people like monarchists and those who opposed the French Revolution, and kind of part of that whole Catholic action. And that was a huge part of this. And I think, again, similar to, we've pointed out a lot of parallels. And just as Luther got involved with the princes of his time, that was part of the reason that got him onto this trajectory of schism. There's an uncanny parallel with Archbishop Lefebvre and the political people that he became involved with and who supported his movement. I would highly recommend looking into that for people. Look into the history of the Sspx and Archbishop Lefebvre. Look at who his friends were, and that will explain a lot about some of the events that took place. But what I would leave people with is ultimately it comes to an issue of trust. Do we trust in the promises of Christ? And do we trust that he will guide his church to the end of time? No matter how disfigured she may look, no matter how much craziness might be going on, or how difficult that may be, even if you find yourself in a desert, you don't ever want to abandon your mother. You don't ever want to abandon the church, because it's only in the church that we can truly achieve that union of God that will eventually lead us to the beatific vision.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Real quick, I just wanted to show you guys this. Dom, send my cheers to John and Andrew. Tell them I'm Ezekiel Becar Varela. I don't know if you guys know who that is.
Yes.
Hi, Ezekiel.
Okay.
Hey, Ezekiel.
Okay, great. You never know. Awesome. Hey, Ezekiel. Okay, so John, any parting words?
I don't have an axe to grind here with the society at all. I'm in this for the service of truth and charity. I know a lot of society priests. I can tell you some of them are truly struggling in their position. And I hope they find the fortitude to leave, frankly. But I believe that a lot of these young men, and I'm probably responsible for leading some people to the society just because I was attending, and I can even say some seminarians as well who become priests. But I can say at least the young men that have gone in, they've been deceived. Archbishop Lefebvre is their rule of faith. That's how they're taught in seminary, frankly. And that has to change. They have to recognize that defect, that Lefebvre is not the rule of faith. The Roman Catholic Church and the Pope, that's the rule of faith. I question whether some of the older clergy within the society, where their hearts are. I hope it's good, and I hope there's some ignorance there and not culpability. But frankly, guys, I've spent a few years studying these issues in depth. Of course, many years prior to that with a foundation, but it didn't take me a whole lot of time to put a lot of this together. Once I dug into it, looking at the society's teaching and then what the churches teaches and what the theology manuals teach. So it takes a little bit of effort, but this to me became very, very evident. And, I hope this does some good for somebody. I do, again, recognize, I attend pretty much exclusively, I attend the traditional Mass. I'm a traditional Catholic, but it's so important to be in union with your local bishop, subject to the Pope for salvation. That's where the rubber meets the road for all Catholics. And I hope, what I'm doing and others are doing, and thankfully what you guys are doing bear some fruit.
On that, you mentioned the importance of being in union with the local bishop. I would recommend go back, everyone, and read St. Irenaeus's Against Heresies. That text has done so much for me. I strongly recommend it. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, John, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. This was a long conversation, but a very interesting, fascinating, and fun conversation. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yes. Thank you, John.
Thank
See
you.
you, Dom.
All right. So if you want to support the show, audience, go ahead and support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And with that being said, we will see you guys next time.